The Mindful Medic podcast is proudly sponsored by the Medical Benevolent Association of New South Wales, ACT. The MBA is an independent charity that has been supporting doctors in New South Wales and the ACT since 1896. They provide specialised counselling, information, referral and financial assistance to doctors and their families during times of adversity or hardship. Their aim is to provide non-judgmental support so that the doctor or family member recovers their well-being and independence and, wherever possible, returns to their vocation. Their services are free, specialised and no referral is necessary. All contact is kept strictly confidential and they are independent of any regulatory body. Hello and welcome back to the Mindful Medic podcast. For those joining us for the first time, a very warm welcome. I am your host, Dr Cheryl Martin. I'm an emergency physician, a yoga teacher, an avid runner, an eternal student, and my mind is full. In this podcast, we are exploring broader paradigms of health, well-being, and optimal performance. Last week, we looked at the consequences of chronic, inappropriate stress, particularly in relation to our work environment and occupational burnout. It's apt that today is Crazy Socks for Docs Day, which is the inspiration of Dr. Jeff Good. And its aim is to raise awareness, advocacy, and a call to action for the issue of mental health in medicine. Thanks, Jeff, for all of the great work that you do in this space. So this week we're still going to focus on our stress response and look at how we might harness it to perform optimally under pressure. As we discussed last week, stress is essentially an important physiological response to perceived threat. It's an innate survival instinct. But as we also discussed with Dr. Sheila Vaidya last week, how that will be expressed is very much influenced by our prior experience. We talked about this concept of adverse childhood experiences and how they may impact us in later life. This idea of fight, flight or fright, and then at the extreme end, freeze. We're no longer running from tigers or bears, however. Modern life has become highly complex, and modern day stressors are an entirely different animal. We obviously need a degree of stress. Ideally, we want to be able to harness the boost of adrenaline and cortisol to motivate us, to focus our attention and help us perform. Too much chronically and inappropriately leads to burnout, as we discussed last week. Too little to boredom, to disengagement. We want to be able to nail that presentation, smash the 10k time trial we've set ourselves. For myself in the emergency department, I want to be able to manage a critically unwell resuscitation or high-risk procedure without freezing, with minimal error. And longer term, that's important. It's not just important for my patient care, but for my sustainability of practice and my own well-being. So this week we're going to look at the factors that influence our ability to perform well under pressure, and also the ways that we might look to improve this. Although my guest this week is a fellow emergency physician, many of the general themes that we discuss apply in many areas of work and play and optimal performance. I hope you enjoy this episode.
So too little pressure, we don't perform well, we're in the zone of disengagement. Too much pressure, we're in the zone of frazzle. and our performance deteriorates. But just with the right sweet spot of optimal pressure, we're in the zone of high performance flow when we are cognitively at our best.
That was Dr Stephen Hearns. Dr Hearns is an emergency and retrieval physician in Scotland. He's also an expert in mountain rescue, and he's the author of a book aptly named Peak Performance Under Pressure. He is also, and I don't think he was actually aware of this, someone who definitely played a role in my decision to pursue a career in emergency medicine. He was one of the first emergency doctors I met as an enthusiastic young student on a selected term in the ED in the west of Scotland. And his leadership, mentorship, encouragement and can-do attitude stood out for me then and still do today. A few years later, I attended one of his expedition medicine courses on the bonny banks of Loch Lomond just before I returned to Australia to continue my fellowship training. And it's clear to me now that, many of the themes that we discuss here, he was advocating for and fostering even then and well before he articulated them all in his book. I thoroughly enjoyed reconnecting in this conversation. Enjoy. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Stephen Hearns. Thank you for giving up your time to share your knowledge and your very practical insights on this topic. As I've said to you, I thoroughly enjoyed the book Peak Performance Under Pressure, and it did reference, as I've also said, a large proportion of my reading list on this topic over the past decade. I've long held a particular interest in the regulation of our stress response and its relationship to how we perform. And I think it's particularly relevant to our professional sphere, but many other professions and many other areas of performance under pressure. In the book, you describe two very personal experiences of clinical experiences of performance under pressure, one early in your career and then one in recent years. And I find the evolution really interesting. So I'd love to begin by asking why this has become an area of particular interest for you.
Yeah, I think the main reason is that I'm not very good at it personally. I suppose the main catalyst was about 5 years ago. We were looking at ways to try and improve how we performed in the emergency medical retrieval service when we were performing emergency anaesthesia, either in rural hospitals or at the roadside. And we made a decision that we were going to start to wear badge cameras. And the way that works is the retrieval practitioner, the nurse or the paramedic that's working with me wears a camera in their flight suit, and they film me and they audio record me, and I record them, and we use that as part of our structured debrief. And what became quite obvious 5 years ago was that if things were going well, particularly if there was a case that was quite predictable how it was going to go, and the patient was responding to treatment, then I would perform well as a doctor and as the leader of the team in terms of my ability to make decisions, to communicate with the rest of the team, to carry out practical tasks. But what also became clear to me was that if the patient was deteriorating or wasn't following the path that I had predicted, that I definitely started to experience excessive pressure, and it became clear that my decision making, my communication, particularly my non-verbal communication, was actually pretty poor, and that was very clear from the footage that we gained. So I became interested in the psychology of why that was happening to me, and what the effects of that pressure, what the effects were on my behaviour and my performance. And then I started to look at different techniques that we could use to try and reduce the incidence of those periods of excessive pressure in myself and in the team. And if we did experience those periods of excessive pressure, how we could try to regain personal control, situational control, and personal composure. So yeah, I think that was the main catalyst for me.
So yeah, so I like the idea of using the term pressure rather than stress, but I think both of those phrases have quite negative connotations for most of us. Can you describe this idea of good stress and why pressure is actually necessary and might actually be a good thing in terms of performance?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think stress for everyone is a term which has got negative connotations, particularly with regard to performance. And I think for most people, the term pressure is also negative. If you listen to any football commentator when a team are 2-0 down, it's always that they're under pressure, and that's going to adversely affect their performance. So, from a personal perspective, what I did with the book is I tried, if at all possible, to stop using the term stress at all. And stress to me means excessive pressure, really, when the pressure is too great and it is compromising performance. But pressure can be good and it can be bad. And I suppose the main theme that runs through the book is the Yerkes-Dodson curve, or the inverted U-shaped curve, which demonstrates the relationship between pressure and performance. And what psychologists have shown is that we actually need a degree of performance in order to motivate us, to arouse us, to focus us until we move into that zone of high performance flow. And if we have actually too little pressure, then we don't get the slow release of adrenaline and cortisol, and we don't experience adequate motivation or arousal, and our performance is suboptimal. And similarly, if we experience excessive pressure, then we get a surge in the release of these stress hormones, and we move into the zone of frazzle. So too little pressure, we don't perform well, we're in the zone of disengagement. Too much pressure, we're in the zone of frazzle, and our performance deteriorates. But just with the right sweet spot of optimal pressure, we're in the zone of high performance flow when we are cognitively at our best.
I really like the pressure pump analogy that you use in the book. I'm interested to know how you came up with it, and can you break it down for our listeners?
Yeah, well, I suppose that the idea behind it is, so I read up a reasonable amount about this relationship between pressure and performance, and ultimately, if you want to achieve peak performance as an individual, as a team, as an organization, you need to achieve that zone of flow. And that is about achieving the optimal level of pressure. So I came up with the term of owning the pressure as an individual, as a team, as an organization. And there are dozens of ways in which we can control the pressure to allow us to own the pressure to achieve that zone of high performance flow. Way before we get into a pressured situation, during it, and if we enter the zone of frazzle to try and regain control of the situation. So I was discussing that with a couple of friends who were engineers, and we talked through different engineering systems which create an optimal level of pressure, say in a pipe system. And if the pressure becomes too low or the pressure becomes too high, they've got inbuilt systems to calibrate that pressure. So I came up with this idea of the pressure pump control system. So it's got four parts to it. There's the pressure pump, which is really what the organisation over a prolonged period puts into the system. And that's about the culture of the organisation. It's about strategic leadership, and very much about selecting the right people for the team, because there's only a a certain number of people that can actually perform optimally under pressure. So that's the pressure pump. Next is the pressure control system. And I think that's what an organization or a team can do in the cold light of day to prepare for a high pressure situation, such as cognitive aids, equipment management, having the right communication strategies. And then the third part of it is pressure testing. And that's quite simply how we train for high pressure situations, with having clear competencies, with drilling practical procedures over training, and then moving into simulation to try and improve our non-technical skills such as communication, teamwork, leadership. And then the fourth part of the model I've called pressure relief valves. What do you do if you or a member of the team experiences excessive pressure in the zone of appraisal? And there are various techniques that we can use to regain personal composure and regain situational control. So it's a 4-part model aiming to own the pressure as an individual, a team, or organization, with the pressure pump, with the pressure control parts, with pressure testing, and if things do go wrong, with pressure relief technique.
So, I mean, I think we did go in last week's episode to the kind of sequelae of when you've come out the other end of frazzle, where we really don't want to be. And the aim is to be in the situation where we can avoid that, and we have the supportive team, the right organization, the right people, the right culture. What are the main factors, do you think, that contribute to frazzle? I mean, obviously there's going to be issues at all of those different points.
Well, the two main things in an acute situation, when we're facing a pressured situation, are cognitive overload and cognitive appraisal. And cognitive overload is having too much information coming into us too quickly in an uncontrolled fashion, and having to make too many decisions or carry out too many actions simultaneously. And then there's cognitive appraisal, which I do particularly does compromise my performance pretty regularly. And that's our initial instinctive response to a pressured situation, where completely out with any conscious thought or control, we compare the situation to ones that we've experienced before, and we project how that situation is going to pan out and what the effects are going to be, say, on a patient or on ourselves. And we can end up with a cognitive appraisal of challenge, i.e., this is a difficult problem, but I can handle it and it's going to have a positive outcome. And that puts us into that zone of flow. Or we can have a cognitive appraisal of threat. This problem is too big, too complicated for me to deal with successfully, and it's going to have a catastrophic outcome. And that pushes us right into that zone of frazzle, generating a stress response.
The book has a strong focus on what's known as metacognition, or this idea of thinking about thinking. I'm very conscious when I'm in the emergency department and it's particularly busy, maybe on a weekend, and I have something that I need to do, and I maybe cross the room, and en route I do the zigzag walk as I'm asked to do 4 other things in transit, and then I get to point B and then forget what I'm actually meant to be doing. And, I mean, Pat Crosscarry famously called the emergency department a laboratory of errors, and I can clearly see why. If you then throw an acute resuscitation, for example, on top of that, you can see how quickly you get into this overwhelm cognitively and, potentially frazzle. So what strategies can I employ to improve my performance in that kind of challenging set of circumstances?
There's a couple of questions there all rolled into one. One is when we look at this pressure and performance curve, it's quite easy to look at it on a piece of paper in 2D and see it as being a static process, i.e., when the pressure reaches a certain level, for any of us, we would all move into that zone of frazzle. That isn't the case, though. So for different people, based on different skills, different levels of experience, then different people are going to move into the zone of frazzle at different times and with different levels of pressure. But also importantly, our response to pressure is going to vary day to day depending on how tired we are, other things that are going on in our life, the environment that we are working in, all can predispose us moving into a zone of excessive pressure and compromised performance. We were undertaking an emergency anaesthetic the other day in our temporary red resuscitation room, and that was significantly more pressured than undertaking an emergency anaesthetic on a critically ill patient in our normal resuscitation room, where all of the equipment was to hand. It was a familiar environment, etc. So when we move into that zone of frazzle varies between people, and it also there's intra-observer variability as well, because of the circumstances that surround that high pressure situation. Also, coming back to what you were touching on there is, I suppose, about multitasking and interruptions. We'd all like to think that we can multitask, i.e., have a look at a chest X-ray for your own patient whilst dealing with a query from a junior colleague.
Yeah, we're not
we
effective.
cannot multitask,
Yeah,
and it's much better to finish one task and move on to the next. And then there's a really good paper by a lady called Kate Kellogg, who's a Canadian emergency physician, that talks about the number of distractions and interruptions which a consultant emergency physician deals with every hour, and that is really bad for cognitive performance if you are repeatedly drawn away from the task that you're trying to complete, to maybe have a sign off an ECG, to deal with a query, to answer a phone call. And the environment that we work in, particularly as emergency physicians, is really not that great for high cognitive performance because of those reasons.
Yeah. I mean, you've spoken about certain individuals that do perform better in the high pressure situations and high stress situations. Do you think that we can improve our own cognitive performance or ability to manage our stress, irrespective of the team, the culture, the environment, with training, specific training in thinking?
Yeah, I think we can, and I think there are simple ways to do that and more complex and time-consuming ways to do it. We started this journey in EMRS by getting aviation colleagues in to talk to us about crew resource management and team resource management. And the biggest benefit of that for us was actually having terminology which we could use to describe how we were feeling and what we were experiencing during a high pressure retrieval, and having just some insight that the types of feelings and behaviors that we were experienced were scientifically recognized and had a term, was halfway to solving the problem. So actually giving people some understanding of the psychology and the emotional response to pressure, and giving them some terms to describe it, I think is halfway there. And then if you really want to improve your performance under pressure, there is the technique of stress inoculation, where we deliberately put people under excessive pressure during a simulation and move them into a zone of frazzle, which we shouldn't do in normal simulation training, but we deliberately do it. And we then stop that simulation and we get people to reflect on how they felt emotionally, physiologically, when they were in that zone of excessive pressure, and also, probably more importantly, what their colleagues observed about them. Then give them some of this terminology, give them some of these pressure relief techniques, and then put them back into another simulation and put them into frazzle again. So the idea would be that at an earlier stage, they would realize that the pressure was becoming excessive, and they could take some steps to regain personal composure and regain situational control. However, what actually happens, especially if you have got a cognitive appraisal of threat, is that your insight into your own behavior and what you're experiencing is lost. You generally think that you are under threat, and you lose insight. So what is really important is that your colleagues recognize that behavior and that response in you, and that they have got tools and techniques to move you back into that zone of flow, because you might not have the ability to do it yourself.
I'd imagine in situ team training and creating a culture of psychological safety is pretty important there.
Well, I suppose again that's I suppose that's some of the techniques that we can use to control pressure. One is particularly in the emergency department, if we've got a pre-alert or standby call coming in, even just for 1 minute, having a short briefing. And part of that is giving everyone a voice, allocating roles. And that means that later on in the resuscitation, particularly if things are going poorly, then other members of the team are more likely to speak up and express their thoughts. And the other technique is to have a cognitive pause or a rally point, and really actively encourage people to speak up, to express their mental model, to let you know what they think needs to be done. But that's again, that rally points are things as a technique that I'm really interested in, but you can do it badly or you can do it well. So I think working as a team, having a pre-briefing can be is absolutely essential. But having regular rally points to achieve a shared and an accurate mental model is pretty vital for effective and coordinated and cooperative teamwork.
I'm really fascinated by this idea of flow and flow states. I've read the original text on the topic by Csikszentmihalyi, the psychologist, who, he talks about this idea of trying to find the sweet spot between the right degree of challenge and skill level. And certainly, I'm sure many of the athletes, and particularly the runners listening, will be familiar with this idea of seeking out the sweet spot or the runner's high. I think the yogis listening will also be familiar with it in a different idea of sthiram, sukham, asanam, this idea of the balance between effort and ease. And, in his book, Mihai's conclusion is that the more we seek out these peak experiences, the happier we tend to be. And I've certainly experienced it in, a well-run resuscitation, despite it being, very, very stressful. What is your take on flow?
This zone of flow where we have got that right level of pressure, where we are optimally creative, innovative, productive, when our communications are at its best, our ability to carry out practical tasks at its best, that is a really pleasant place to be, both in that moment and when we reflect on that experience.
And how often do you think you experience flow in practice?
I absolutely get there if with retrieval, particularly on in pre-hospital missions with a major trauma patient who responds to the treatment that we have, and when I have half a dozen paramedics and retrieval practitioners working alongside of me, and we're working cooperatively in a coordinated fashion, and the pressure is just at the right level for maybe 30 minutes up to an hour, and I leave the patient in the emergency department in a better state than physiologically than they were when I arrived at the scene. Then absolutely that pressure, when it's at that optimal level for that period, and I know that I've performed well in that, then that's a reasonably regular occurrence in pre-hospital care, and that's the main attraction of it. But the downside is that in order to have that experience, you're going to have lots of other experiences where you have got a mental model in your head about how things are going to project, how things are going to pan out, and they don't work that way, or the team isn't working as efficiently as you wanted it to, and the pressure becomes excessive, and it's a very unpleasant experience, both at the time and certainly when you reflect on it afterwards.
You describe a retrieval experience at the end of the book just like this, and it's a joy to read this orchestrated symphony playing out and everybody performing optimally. And it's clear to get to that level of performance has required a lot of time and training and input at all levels of the pressure pump system. A lot of the performance literature that I have read has been drawn from the athletic experience, and I often wonder if we should be training our doctors more like our elite athletes. I think in recent years we have paid a bit more attention to, rather than thousands of hours to gain mastery, a move to more deliberate practice, introducing simulation. Still wonder if we could go further with specific drilling in more areas, improving coaching, periodization. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Do you know? I don't know much about the science of education and medical training, but just when I was just thinking when you were talking about that there, and the comparison between sport and medicine. So medicine is so much based on experiential training. The more hours that you put in the hospital, the more patients that you see, that you will get better. We wouldn't train an Olympic marathon runner like that. We wouldn't say, in order to train for the London Marathon next year, I want you to run 26 miles 5 or 6 days a week. You wouldn't do that. But in order to train, for example, an emergency physician, we will the majority of emergency medicine training is working in an emergency department for 10-hour shift after 10-hour shift. I think we particularly should have a lot more emphasis on drilling of practical procedures rather than just simulation. I think we need a lot more human factors training, I've been educational supervisor of trainees now for 15 years, and I have had no training about how to coach people. So yeah, as I say, I don't know much about educational psychology, and I don't know much about medical training, but what we do in medicine is very different to what an experienced coach would do for a high performance athlete and trying to improve their performance.
I find it quite amusing that you say you've had no specific training on coaching or mentorship. You were one of my very first clinical mentors in the emergency department as a medical student many moons ago. I remember you taught me to do some of my very first procedures on patients. So that for me at the time would have required performance under pressure. And I think the other thing that stands out in retrospect, looking back on it now, you probably imparted a lot of the knowledge that is now in the book quite organically without realising it. I famously wrote down the recipe for an IV, an intravenous cannulation, so a checklist or cognitive aid in my or my attempt to become consciously competent. So yeah, and I think that experience also says a lot about the leadership and the culture, this idea of psychological safety for someone very inexperienced going into an environment that at that point was still quite alien to me. So I kind of wanted to move on to talk more about the idea of culture. We've already had a great football analogy, which the men in my family will appreciate, but they're also big Drucker fans. So this idea that culture eats strategy for breakfast, do you think culture is everything?
Yeah, I think culture and strategic leadership in an organisation is part of this, the pressure pump part of the pressure model are absolutely essential to own the pressure. The culture of the organisation, the overall leadership, and how people are selected have a huge effect. Weeks, months down the line, when an individual or a team as part of that organisation is in a high pressure situation. So there's lots of things that we could, I suppose, talk about leadership and culture and selection. But one thing that I did come across was the iceberg model of the psychological contract that really struck a chord with me. And what that is about is, if you can imagine an iceberg with the top of the iceberg above the water, but the huge mass of the iceberg is actually below the surface. And if we divide the iceberg vertically down the middle into two halves, and in one half is what the organization needs from the individual, what the individual can give to the organization, and then the other half is what the organization can do to support the individual. And on the surface, there's just two small sections. On one side, it's superficially what hours that the person puts in, what hours of work they do, and then the other side, it's how much they get paid for putting that time in. But if you go below the surface, there's a lot more that isn't overt and obvious to people. In that in a high performance organization, you need so much more from each individual than simply turning up for work and doing the minimum. You need their commitment, their loyalty. You need them to be proud of the organization. You need them to be innovative. You need them to take ownership and responsibility. But their productivity and their performance in those areas isn't actually related to how much you pay them. It's related to what is on the other side of the iceberg below the surface, such as giving them a nice environment to work in, realizing that they need the right work-life balance, giving them the right equipment, investing in training, seeing potential in individuals, and giving them the support that they need to develop, having the courage to give them responsibility and delegate to them, and celebrating successes in each individual as they progress. So that really struck a chord for me about cultures and the an effective style of leadership in a high performance organization. Realizing that it's not about how much you pay someone, but it's how much you value them, and how much you support their development, and you get so much more back in return in terms of the quality of people that you've got in your team, and indeed their performance in a high pressure situation.
Something that particularly stood out for me in the book, from your EMRS experience, was the way that you delegated to a group of very high performing individuals, effectively leaders in their own right, roles and responsibilities within the team. So the Mayo Clinic experience, the article that we talked about in the last episode, talks about the 80-20 rule of employee engagement. So if you can give your employees, or let them spend about 20% of their time doing that thing which they love most about their work, then that is reflected in positive engagement and investment, and I've no doubt performance.
Yeah, that was quite specific to the Emergency Medical Retrieval Service in Scotland. From the outset, 15 years ago, even though we started as an unpaid voluntary organisation, we made the decision that this should be a consultant delivered service. And now we have, in the Glasgow base, we've got 30 consultants, and we have about 10 really highly qualified nurses and paramedics working in advanced retrieval practitioner roles. So each of these individuals has been carefully selected for their ability to perform under pressure, for their abilities to take on board information and make decisions, for their ability to lead high pressure situations. But what that ends up with is a team of leaders who are all confident, independent thinkers. And the way that we approached that was to delegate and emancipate as much as possible. And each individual member of that team has got an area of responsibility for service development, and that gives everyone a sense of pride, a sense of ownership, and actually has worked out really extremely well over the past 15 years.
I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation that when I was reading your book, I noticed that you had referenced many of the other great texts that I have read around this topic over the past decade or so. And my aim is to ultimately have a book list to accompany this series. But I'm curious to know if you had a favourite book that you had read in researching peak performance under pressure.
Yeah, the book was actually inspired by Atul Gawande's checklist manifesto. How anyone managed to write a 200-page book about checklists, and actually it being interesting was pretty impressive. But no, that I enjoyed that book, and I thought it was really interesting. The how something which clearly improved patient safety, patient care, improved teamwork, could be actively rejected by so many people, and it took so long to implement. So definitely the checklist manifesto is a fascinating insight to improving patient safety, but also a book that's pretty readable.
So finally, when we come to that last part of the pressure pump, the pressure relief valves, I heard you talking on another podcast, and you had this fantastic mnemonic, which I thought was very apt, given this is a conversation between two Scots. So it was Cam Dune. I'd love you to talk us through it.
Yeah, well, again, we had an award ceremony in EMRS, I think about 5 years ago again, and the retrieval practitioners gave me the Cam Dune Award, where obviously I was moving quite frequently into this zone of frazzle, and they'd also developed their own term of being herniated. There was a look that I could give them, and it's when things were going wrong, and that Stephen Hearns had herniated them. And I thought that would be a good mnemonic to try and describe the different techniques that we can use when we're in that zone of frazzle. We want to control the pressure. We need to regain our personal composure, and we need to regain situational control. And it's not an ideal order that it comes out in, but that's about 8 techniques that we can use. So simply control breathing, to control our excessive output in our sympathetic nervous system. The A is for articulating, actually letting people know that you're experiencing excessive pressure at that time so that the team can support you. The next 3, making a list of problems, achieving a shared mental model, and delegating, are all parts of a rally point. Pausing and letting everyone briefly let you know what they think the problem is and what needs to be done, and then summarizing that with a mental model which everyone shares and hopefully is accurate, listing and prioritizing what needs to be done, and then delegating those actions. And that helps to cognitively offload the leader, but it also cognitively reframes, hopefully from a cognitive phrasal of threat to one of challenge. The O of Cam Dune, the first O is outside. Actually removing yourself from a situation, even just for 20 or 30 seconds, getting yourself away from the high pressure stimuli and thinking about something completely different, is very effectively in cognitively reframing yourself, moving from threat and regaining a cognitive appraisal of challenge. The next one is outsourcing. Phoning a friend that might have some specialist knowledge that might be able to give you some advice with decision making, who isn't in the thick of that high pressure situation. And also that refers to remembering to look at cognitive aids. I think very frequently we end up in very high pressure situations, and then when we reflect back on them, we realize that we did actually have an action card or a guideline that we could have referred to, but we forgot to do so. Mm-hmm. And then the final one, it was just to try and come up with something that started with N, was nutrition. And that's it is a problem for us in the ED, and certainly with prolonged retrieval missions, is if you haven't eaten for some time or you're dehydrated, then you are much more likely to fall into that zone of frazzle. So Cam Dune, so control breathing, articulating to the team, list and prioritize, shared and accurate mental model, delegating tasks, getting outside to cognitively frame, outsourcing, and maintaining nutrition and hydration.
That's great. I'm going to be adding that onto my HALT, the hungry, angry, late, tired. That's fantastic. I'm going to reference, so I'll let people listening know where they can access the book. Or actually, you might be able to tell us at the moment how we can get hold of the book.
There's 2 ways. You can get it from Amazon, or you can actually get it direct from the publisher, which is Class Publishing, and you get a 30% discount if you use the code PEAK30. So capital PEAK30 will get you a 30% discount on the book.
I think that was the one I took. And you have got some actual online workshops in motion around this, all of the topics that we've discussed today. Can you tell me a wee bit about those?
Yeah.
Because they're probably particularly drilled at, you can tell me who they're particularly aimed at
Yeah,
as
so
well.
what happened was because of the whole idea of the book was to be pre-reading for a face-to-face course, which I had developed. I'd run some pilot courses, and I was just about to launch them when the coronavirus pandemic started. So that prevented face-to-face teaching. So I had a few messages from people saying, what about starting an online course? So over the past couple of months, what I've done is I have developed a course with 12 short video presentations and half a dozen downloads and exercises. And that is launching this Saturday, the 6th of June. And the website for that, my main website is corecognition.co.uk. The website for the course is corecognitioncourses.co.uk, corecognitioncourses.co.uk.
Perfect. So I like to finish these episodes with some more personal questions for my guests. This series so far has introduced some of my most respected colleagues who I like to say extend borders in the way they think and they practice. And I think you really move us forward. But I'm always curious to know how you keep your own cup full. So, can you tell me what good health means to you?
That's a good question. I think it's getting the balance of things right for you. I once went on a time management course years ago, and they talked about the wheel of life, and I realised that in my wheel there was quite a few long spokes and a lot of very short spokes. So that's sort of stuck in my mind. I um, I absolutely relate physical well-being with mental well-being, and exercise is important to me. And definitely wild places, outdoor spaces, and in terms of, I suppose, cognitive reframing, and I am a lot more innovative when I'm in those types of environment. And that's what I found most challenging, I think, with the lockdown period here. I was went to a mountain rescue last week, and I didn't actually need to go on the hill. Some other guys had already found the people, and just to be back in that mountain environment to see the hills but not actually be able to go into them was quite difficult. So I think physical exercise and wild spaces are important to me, and trying to think about that idea of this wheel of life, and making sure that I'm not putting too much of my time into one part of my life, and trying to spread it out a bit more evenly is valuable to me.
Perfect. I really miss the mountains too. So based on that, I think I can probably predict what you'll say for this, but what would your ideal self-care Sunday? I know that self-care Sunday sometimes happens on a Wednesday for emergency physicians, but what would it be like?
So pretty much it's Sunday morning regularly. I meet up with, in normal circumstances, half a dozen of my mates, and we do a 2 or 3 hour cycle. Luckily, one of them's got a cafe, which we go back to afterwards.
Perfect.
And then it's back and really just actually spend the rest of the day at home with my family. Yep, that's
ideal.
That's an ideal Sunday for me.
And in times of professional, personal challenge, you probably employ some of the strategies we've talked about, but what are your go-to strategies, or do you have any self mantras or positive affirmations or other techniques that you use for yourself in the moment of challenge?
Yeah, I absolutely use positive self-talk, and I was using that even before I knew that that's what it was called. Definitely positive self-talk, and the idea of cognitive reframing. I will pretend that I've got to make a phone call and get out of the situation for 20, 30 seconds. And that works pretty effectively for me. So definitely positive self-talk and getting out of the situation for a short period.
You have just been listening to Dr. Stephen Hearns. I'll put a link to Stephen's website and details of how you can access the book in the show notes. As I've mentioned, I also hope to have a book list available shortly to accompany this first series. We will revisit many of the themes discussed here today throughout future episodes. And for anyone who's been listening since the beginning, I think it's pretty clear there are already emerging threads. I have mentioned that today is Crazy Socks for Docs Day, so I really encourage you, after listening to this, to go back and have a listen to episode 3. And if you're feeling particularly overwhelmed today, or you just need some time out to reset and centre, then I encourage you to fast forward to the 50-minute mark, where Dr. Sheila Vaidya leads us through a beautiful, short, grounding breath practice. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to joining you again next week. The MBA New South Wales ACT does wonderful work for those of our colleagues who are, at this very minute, experiencing a hard time. One way you can show you care about doctors' welfare is to go to their website, www.mbansw.org.au, and donate today. Knowing that their colleagues' care is a big part of these doctors' recovery, so please be part of the solution. All donations are tax deductible. If you can, please consider a monthly donation, as even small amounts collectively will allow them to plan their growth to support the increased demand.